Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 477. All right, guys, welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise awareness of trauma and to support new trauma therapists just starting out on their trauma-informed journey. I do that through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. If you're a therapist of any kind, interested in learning about trauma, and you're looking for support and inspiration, I invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 by going to traumatherapist2.com. That's Trauma Therapist, the number 2.com. All right, let's get started. This episode is sponsored by Somatic Experiencing. Trauma may be a fact of life, but it doesn't have to be a life sentence. Somatic Experiencing is a psychobiological method of addressing clients' physical and emotional trauma conditions and helps to give voice to their experiences without a need for them to retell their story. SE focuses on regulation of the nervous system and offers the opportunity to engage, complete, and resolve the body's instinctual responses to traumatic experiences. For more information regarding somatic experiencing and the SE professional training program, the Trauma Therapist Podcast listeners can visit traumahealing.org/TTP. That's traumahealing.org/TTP. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I'm very excited to have my guest today, Jen Warner. Jen, welcome.
Thank you.
All right.
I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. So Jen Warner is a Washington, Oregon, and New York State licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist with advanced training and certification in trauma-informed care and the treatment of trauma, as well as holistic health and nutrition. She currently specializes in working with individuals living with traumatic stress related to acute, chronic, and terminal illness and pain conditions, and is committed to growing understanding of chronic illness as a trauma and the need for implementing trauma-informed care within organizations that serve this population and their caregivers. Mm-hmm. A lot. Awesome. Well, once again, welcome. Share with our listeners, before we get going here, where you're from originally and then where you are currently, and then we'll dive in.
Okay. I'm actually from New York City originally, and I'm now living in Seattle after living in Portland, Oregon for a couple of years. So we're really, it's really a bit hard because Seattle, of course, is ground zero for coronavirus, or it was, and now New York City is dramatically impacted. So
right.
It's definitely in my heart and mind right now. How are
you doing personally?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting having this as my specialty because it's certainly, I'm seeing trauma and traumatization on a really global scale, certainly in my practice. I mean, my clients have their own trauma histories, and then all of them are living with some form of, or the majority of them are living with acute and chronic, and as I said, terminal illness. And so having a pandemic is, you can imagine, triggering at best and traumatizing at worst.
Right. Well, all right. So let's kind of start here. I'm just constantly amazed by people like yourself who do this work, who get in. How do you get into this work? And that's really what this podcast is about. Mm-hmm. So let's start with that. How did you get into this field?
That's a really great question. I was actually a documentary television producer for 10 years. And the focal point of my work was I was really interested in and did a lot of work on documentaries on violent crime. And my father was district attorney in the Bronx for 30 plus years. So that was already sort of in my blood. He worked on some really high profile cases. And when I got into that work, making documentaries on that and working for some television networks, I really found that I was most interested in working and hearing the stories of both the families, the survivors, the perpetrators. I mean, I had the opportunity to speak to so many different people. Mm-hmm. But the problem with media and the problem with television is that there's always an agenda. And I realized that I really wanted to hear the stories, do the work, be with the people, but I didn't want to have to subscribe to the agenda that network TV requires.
When you say there was always an agenda, what do you mean? Do you mean that the TVs, for example, always create an agenda, or there's an underlying agenda? There has to be an agenda. What do you mean?
I mean, there's a story that needs to be told. We have to keep viewers interested, and so how do we tell a story, even if it's about a high-profile crime, that's going to keep people interested? And at the time that I was doing that work, it was in the 90s and the very early 2000s. We had a very, very different understanding about trauma. Actually, we were poorly or unbelievably ill-informed about trauma. And so that the way that we were telling stories was just not trauma-informed at all. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the deciding moment for me, I had a couple of deciding moments about the fact that I knew I wanted to go into social work anyway, but it took me a number of years to finally do that. And, I worked on a very, very high-profile case on domestic violence, and with a woman who was, with Hedda Nussbaum. That was a high-profile case in New York City. It was the first case that really got media attention on white-collar domestic violence. And I worked closely with Hedda and closely with her lawyer, and they shared photos and stories with me that they hadn't told anybody else. And then we made the show, and the network wanted it presented in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And that was not, it was not a trauma-informed way. And it was not the way that I wanted to tell the story. And that happened a couple of times. And the show broadcast, and I got this letter from Hedda and her lawyer saying, we were really disappointed in how the story was told. And it broke my heart. Yeah. It really broke my heart, because I knew they were right. They were absolutely right. And so I had a couple of situations like that happen over the years working in television. And I just decided, this is not for me. This is not how I want to do the work. And, I'm still very closely connected. I have very close friends. My spouse is still involved in television and media, but I just couldn't do it. I knew my heart was in something else, and that was actually doing direct service work. So
when you said initially that your dad was a DA in the Bronx for 30 years, and you found yourself kind of into violent crime in a sense, what was it about that, and what was it about you that you felt allowed you to do that?
Such a great question. And I'm not even sure I have a great answer. My father was so committed to the work that he was doing. And he never gave us the details, but I could see how much it impacted him. And he really believed in what he was doing, and he believed in the people that he was advocating for. And I remember hearing that and seeing that and thinking, God, I want to do that. I don't want to be a lawyer, but I know that there's got to be some way for me to do this. And when I shifted out of television, I had also, when I left television in 2005, at the end of 2005, I actually became chronically ill myself. It was about a year of dealing with some pretty serious health issues. And in that time, I committed to going into social work. And just almost immediately upon launching into social work, I was like, I've arrived. This is really where I belong. And I was introduced to, obviously trauma on a large scale. And I during my work, I had some fabulous opportunities to work with some exceptional people in hospice, and also the Coalition for the Homeless in New York City. And soon after, after graduation, I said, I want to work with survivors of violent crime. That's where I want to work. And that's actually how I started working, had the opportunity to work in an incredible clinic in New York City and learn from truly the best of the best on trauma-informed care, and committed myself to doing that. And, so that's how I found myself there. But what's the calling? What's the meat of it? I think you either have a passion for it or you don't. It is the hardest work I've ever done, but I've never felt more like I belong in something than I do in that. So, man.
I think I first learned about you on Twitter.
Oh, yeah.
And you have a presence there, and you have a really strong presence there in the sense that, I was becoming aware of your work there, if you will, and you can tell that you feel passionately about helping individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what drew me to you in a sense. So you get into social work, you have this great experience. How do things evolve such that you're doing this work on this scale?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I had, right before starting social work school, I had been diagnosed with some chronic health conditions, a couple of which were quite serious. And so I was having to manage my own health and be in this world. And so I worked with Safe Horizon and the Safe Horizon Counseling Center in New York City. And that's where I really learned how to do the work. But the evolution of that, the clients I had the tremendous privilege of working with. It was funny because it was during that time that I realized how much trauma impacts the body, impacts health and wellness. And in working with the clients there, I became acutely aware of my own body, my own health, what was happening in my own body, and also what was happening for them too. And so that, as we talk more, that's how it later evolved into the work that I am currently doing. But after working with Safe Horizon, or while working at Safe Horizon, I also started working. I was the crime victim social worker at Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx, which is the largest public hospital in New York City. So it was myself and an incredible supervisor, and we were doing the crime victim work.
Wow.
So we worked for the Office of Victim Services, and my supervisor was also one of the hospital social workers there. But I have to say, and you can tell me how many specifics you want, but it was just my head is full of stories. I'm a storyteller by heart and by nature, but it's almost like where to begin. The people that I met, the things that I saw, the experiences that I had in that work. And it just grew the passion because what I learned more than anything was you have to listen.
Mm.
You really have to actively listen. You need to shut your mouth and listen to what people have to say, and also be with them in their embodied experience. And that means being attuned to all sorts of cues, not just what they say, but also what's happening for their bodies, in their body language, how they're communicating things to you. I could tell you plenty of stories, but
yeah, let's, not to sensationalize this, but this is what this is about. So if you would share a story that, you would maybe illustrate what it means to what you mean by saying to listen more than what they have to say, and to watch people's bodies and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the story that comes to mind was when I was working in the Bronx at Lincoln. I was sent upstairs. I used to have to go downstairs to the emergency room or up to the various medical floors or to the ICU, anywhere there was a crime victim. And, I'd be sent. I'd get the call and they'd be like, okay, Jen, you got to go up there and see what's going on. And here I am. I'm a nice middle-aged white lady. I look the way that I do, right? And I'm very aware of that. And I walk into this room, and it's a young African-American man. And the nurses, as I was walking in, they'd said, this guy's been here for 6 months. And I said, how come I've only gotten the call now? And they were like, well, he didn't want services. And, he's really aggressive and he throws things at us and he doesn't want to talk to anybody. Good luck, good luck. And there was all this signage all over his door and a police officer standing outside the door. And it was just like, man, this is not how we do, And so I walk in and I introduce myself, and I probably can't curse on here, but he told me where to go. You know what I mean? Where he was like, get out of here. Just, what are you doing here? Mm-hmm. And, I could tell that he was curious that I was there, and I didn't shirk. I said, I absolutely hear you. If you'd like me to leave, I will. But I just want the opportunity to talk to you. And also, maybe help you get what you're entitled to as a crime victim. You know what I mean? And so he let me in, and he allowed me to pull up a chair, and he told me some stuff, and then he's like, okay, I want you to go now. And so, I said, absolutely. I left. And I said, here's my number. Call me if you need me again. And he ended up calling me. And I would go up to, I was the only one he allowed in the room. I mean, nurses and doctors, like, he didn't want to deal with them, but he allowed me into the room. He allowed me into the space. And mostly I got to listen. And I had the privilege of listening and hearing his story. And, as when I first arrived, his arms were crossed and he, pushed his tray away from me. And then the more we visited, and when he actually was eventually discharged, it took quite a long time because he had experienced some horrible violence. And when he was finally discharged, he would come see me in my office. And we developed a rapport. And he actually, he went from crossed arms and leaning back to sitting forward and telling me to pull a chair up a little bit closer and showing me things that he had made and drawings that he had made. And we visited, and, he had some other health issues as well. And I got to meet his mom. He brought his mom to meet me one day. To me, these are just like, it's just like, my heart feels like it's going to blow up, Yeah. So
let me ask you something. How much experience had you had when you met that guy? All right, guys, just quickly, I want to thank Sensory Motor Psychotherapy Institute for being a sponsor on this podcast. Do you struggle to help numb, disconnected clients who can't feel emotion or explore inner experience? Learn a comprehensive approach to conceptualize your client's concerns. As someone who's gone through the level 1 and level 2 trainings of sensory motor psychotherapy training, I can really speak to the power of this training. For me, it was a game changer and is so inspiring. Sensory motor psychotherapy uniquely includes the body and therapy as both a source of information and a target for intervention, because words are not enough. Go beyond theories and gain practical ways to open a new dimension for effective therapy. Visit Sensory Motor Psychotherapy Institute online today at sensorymotor.org. That's sensorymotor.org.
At that point, I had probably about 4 or 5 years of experience.
Okay. So you had some stuff under your belt, but it's just interesting. So in your words, what happened there? Why do you think those people, and I'm asking this for the benefit of our listeners here, why do you think that, you had that experience with that man, whereas the nurses or those other women were like, oh no, those things, she doesn't want to listen, What was it that you did or didn't do, or the way you held yourself that allowed you to get in?
Respect, number one. Respect, deference, and recognizing that, again, I think the experience of trauma, when somebody has lived through a single trauma or multiple traumas, they have seen a side of existence that, if you're lucky, you will never have to see. And I think, and knowing his story, knowing a bit about his story, knowing what he had lived through, I was really in great awe of his ability to survive. Things had been horrible, truly horrible for him since he was, born. Basically.
And how old was he when you met him?
I think he was about 25.
Okay.
About 25. He had experienced numerous gunshot wounds up until that point. At this point, at 25, he experienced one to the abdomen that had then paralyzed him from the waist down. So his entire life was about to change. And, it was going in. So knowing that he had lived through so much, again, I recognized, I think it's the ability to recognize, that one is in awe of people who survive, how they survive, the fact that you can experience horrible things and still be here. Even drugs and alcohol and all of these things that we pathologize as like, he's a drug addict or he's an alcoholic or whatever. People will use a number of things to just survive.
Right.
And the ability to do that is one that I am in absolute awe of. And so going in there, recognizing my own privilege as somebody who could walk around, because he was not going to be able to walk again, right? But also recognizing that he was a true survivor and giving him that due, and just shutting up and listening. So I wasn't putting myself in a position of, I was like, oh, here I am, the hospital social worker. I'm here to bring you things and tell you how it is. No, I'm here because you're allowing me to be here. I am here to assist you if you need assistance, if you want assistance, but I'm also mostly here to hear your story and bear witness to that. And I think that that's something that is maybe the foundation of being trauma informed, if you want to use the fancy term, but it's really about human connection, and it's about having respect for anybody around you and for what they've survived. Because often, in that case, I knew what he had survived. I had the privilege of looking at his chart. I had the privilege of hearing it, and he allowed me to hear his story. But we walk around and we encounter people, we have no idea what they've lived through. So I think that, again, as a former television producer and storyteller, my nature is to listen to other people's stories, but everybody has a story. And I think to be truly trauma informed, again, a very overused word, you have to listen. And it's not just using your ears, it's using your eyes, it's using all 5 of your senses and being open and receptive to that.
When you were first starting out as a social worker, was that your perspective? Was that your stance? Did you come in as open like that, or was it a little different? Was it, I'm the social worker and, I have just been through school and I learned these things and I'm here to help you and fix you and heal you and change you?
No, I mean, I think I have 2 parents who taught me well, and I grew up in a neighborhood and had friends who taught me well about listening and showing respect to people, that it doesn't really matter what your job is. Everybody deserves respect and everybody deserves that kind of attention. I think in terms of thinking I'm bigger than or better than, I think, one thing that you had mentioned in your questions was about a clinical error. And I think that one thing that early social workers or anybody early in the work, many of us go into this work because we want to help so badly and we want to rescue so badly. And, I certainly have my own history, and I certainly have maybe started in the work wanting to help. I put that in quotes because it's also wanting to rescue. I want to get in there and I want to help everybody and save everybody, and overstepping perhaps, and not seeing people's strengths or hearing people's strengths or allowing them to demonstrate their strengths, and that I am not the rescuer. I am not the great hero of the story. They are. I do think I went into it with some a good foundation, but I also went into it with my own personal history, which means that while I didn't go in there thinking I was all powerful and all, I'm the social worker and listen to me. I did go in there, I think, initially, very early in the work, thinking I'm the helper and the saver. I'm supposed to save you and rescue you. And so it's a slight semantic difference, but, so it was less about the power of it, though, and more about the idea of though maybe that is power. That's probably anyway.
Let me just remind everyone that I'm speaking with Jen Warner. She's at jenwarnerhealth.com. That's JenWarner health.com.
Actually, the website's changed. It's jenwellness.com.
Jenwellness.com. All right. Sorry about that. I'll have that linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. So what are you doing now? What the heck are you doing?
Very good question. Thank you for that. When I left New York City, I had a private practice, but I was also still the crime victim social worker at Lincoln. And I left that. We moved to Portland, Oregon, where I opened a private practice. And I was also teaching at the graduate social work school at Portland State on abuse and trauma. And then we moved to Seattle. My spouse took a job in Seattle, and so I have a private practice here now. And my focus has evolved into working with people who are living, again, largely with acute and chronic and terminal illness, many of whom also have complex trauma histories. So
what a constellation. I mean, that's it doesn't get more intense than that.
It's intense. It is intense, but it's beautiful work. Because again, there's so much overlap. Trauma really deeply, and so much incredible writing reflects this, how much trauma affects the body. And so many of the folks that I see come to me with unbelievable chronic health conditions, and in addition to that, they also have trauma in their background, childhood trauma, and maybe some experiences of interpersonal violence. But the way that, this is a slight shift from what we've been talking about, but the way that illness, particularly chronic illness that requires watchful waiting. Again, I'm going to put that in quotes, watchful waiting, which is a nice medical term that doctors use, or, diagnoses with unusual names, the things that people haven't heard of, that require almost ultra marathoner strength to deal with on a daily basis, because there's no cure for it. There's no great treatment for it. And so the folks that are living with these conditions must live in constant awareness of something changing in their bodies, or they're living with chronic pain, or they're living with things that are just disruptive enough. Postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, commonly known as POTS, is something that affects your entire autonomic nervous system. So you're at the mercy of your autonomic nervous system. Most people never think of their autonomic nervous system. That's blood pressure and heart rate, pupil dilation, sweating, digestion. The point of an autonomic nervous system is it does its own thing, right? It's supposed to just keep things in balance. People who are living with POTS or any kind of autonomic failure do not have that regulation. So passing out is a big part, standing up and passing out is a big part of the problem, or, thoroughly disrupted digestion. And so, that's a small one. But it's disruptive. And I think that a lot of people living with these illnesses are deeply, deeply misunderstood. And it's so much of my work, it's balancing their experience of this kind of constant re-traumatization of, or dealing with the triggers that their body is presenting to them on a daily basis. And when we think about trauma treatment, we think about finding safety in the body and finding safety in your own skin and coming home to your body. But when your body doesn't feel safe, how do you do that? So it's a great puzzle, but it's one that I feel pretty privileged to be able to do.
Awesome. So as we kind of wind down here, you've had, you've been teaching this work. What would you say to the therapists out there, the newer therapists out there who are just maybe becoming trauma informed, if you will? What would you say to them, or how would you guide them for people who want to do this work, maybe don't have the confidence or are scared that they're going to, re-traumatize someone else or get triggered themselves?
That's a great question. And I'd say that listen, actively listen, and remember that you're talking to another human being. And ask questions first before you want to deliver tools and give help again and give all this stuff. Ask somebody what they need. And maybe they don't exactly know what they need, but then it's checking in with them and asking them about what their strengths are. What are they good at? Really taking yourself out of this us and them role and relating to people as people. But we all are. And I think that there's, right now in the midst of a pandemic, and we're experiencing social distancing, and we're not able to connect with people. I think a lot of folks are recognizing how important human connection is. There's so many ways to connect. And first and foremost, is asking somebody, how are you? How are you? How's your body? How are you feeling today? How are you doing? And that's, I think if nothing else, it's humbling yourself before other people's humanity is it's a gift. So don't be scared, be human. They are being human at the same time. So
what would you recommend in terms of a go-to book, whether trauma related or not, or?
Well, trauma and recovery a great. It's probably the primer, and then Trauma in the Body. Pat Ogden's Trauma in the Body is one of my all-time favorites. Okay. So those two definitely.
Awesome. We'll have those linked up. All right, Jen. So what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Well, there's my website, which is jenwellness.com, and then email.
Okay, awesome. Well, it's been a pleasure, and it's been a while. You've been on my radar for a long time, and it's been awesome to have you on here.
Yeah, and thank you for the wonderful work you're doing, Guy. It's tremendous. Your show's great. I love it.
I appreciate that. Yeah, all right, take care.
Thank you so much. Okay, bye.
Once again, thank you to Somatic Experiencing for sponsoring this podcast. Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to resolving trauma worldwide by providing professional training and education in somatic experiencing. It was founded by Dr. Peter Levine, author of the bestseller Waking the Tiger, who developed somatic experiencing based on explorations of how animals deal with threat, nervous system overwhelm, and traumatic experiences on a daily basis. Learn more about somatic experiencing and the SE Professional Training Program at traumahealing.org/TTP. That's traumahealing.org/TTP.